pandemic. That's a lot of death and a lot of grieving. Now, a new diagnosis adopted by the American Psychiatric Association seeks to classify prolonged grief. Tonight, I sit down with mental health professionals and those who've experienced intense grief to find out how this might change how we treat those who are grieving.
All of us yearn for the person that we've lost after they die.
Dr. Patricia Harney is a clinical psychologist and a faculty member at Harvard Medical School. She says prolonged grief disorder, which was added to the DSM-5 this year, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is really an extreme form of grieving.
It's normal to stay preoccupied with death for some time after our loved one passes. But prolonged grief disorder might be diagnosed if those feelings persist for more than a year and really disrupt a person's life.
According to a 2021 study, 1 in 10 people who have lost someone suffer from prolonged grief, which can also put them at higher risk of developing other health problems.
The primary advantages to this are that it allows us to identify people who may need more care and attention.
Harney says many aspects of the pandemic could also lead to prolonged grief disorder, including the sudden death of a loved one, not being able to be with a loved one as they die, or having to isolate instead of holding a funeral.
For every one person who dies, there are 5 or 6 people close to them who are grieving that person's death. So then you could say there are 5 to 6 million people grieving the loss of someone who's died due to COVID.
And while anyone can suffer from prolonged grief, a study published in the Journal of Death and Dying found that African Americans are more likely to experience it. Experts say it's likely because of systemic racism, a cultural stigma around getting mental health help, and overall barriers to care.
We know that Black and brown communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID. Some families have lost many family members, and so the grief gets compounded by these public health disparities that Black and brown communities are contending with.
Being in the African American community, there's a lot of oppression and marginalized individuals that, the stigma, if you do go to mental health or seek out behavioral health, you're weak.
Crystal Morris is a licensed professional counselor who owns Butterflies Prospering Wellness in Killeen. She's seen clients throughout the pandemic suffering from grief and wants to be an advocate, especially for those who might be afraid to seek treatment.
It's okay to ask for help. You're not weak, and this, just like we go to the doctor for physical elements, this is a check-in with your mental health.
Savannah Perez Villarreal deals with grief every day as an administrator at Young's daughter's funeral home in Temple.
I wish people would stop saying that grief is for the weak.
She also runs a grief support group for Alzheimer's and dementia caregivers. It's something she says she needed when she was caring for her grandmother who had the disease.
There was times I didn't know, where to turn to. I felt so lost. You have no motivation to get out of bed, no motivation to comb your hair or do anything, because it takes that toll on you. And this is something that people don't realize.
Her goal is to help others cope while offering support through the lessons she's learned about her own grief.
When you have people supporting you and the community supporting you, it helps you get through that grief just a little better and a little faster. We're all human. We all have emotions, and we need to learn how to cope and overcome the grief and be able to live on with grief. Personally, I think that grief never goes away. It just gets tolerable with time.
And Harney agrees. Her boyfriend was murdered more than 30 years ago when she was a college senior. And while she found ways to cope, it's something she's never forgotten.
It is something that I've thought about and stayed with me and has had impact on me throughout my life.
And although critics of prolonged grief disorder worry it might create more of a stigma, Harney hopes it changes the way our entire society begins to see those who are grieving.
There's no cookie-cutter formula for how long people should grieve. And we do need to respect that people grieve in their own time frame.
Now, if you or someone you know is experiencing grief and would like to find out about local support groups, we have that information for you over on our website. That's KCENTV.com. We'll be right back.